All right, good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to our Brown Bag Lunch series with the Rochester Avon Historical Society. My name is Kathy Fitzpatrick. I'm the program coordinator with the Rochester Hills Museum at Van Hoosen Farm. But without further ado, we'll go ahead and get started. I'm going to hand off to Tiffany Deserman. She's the president of the Rochester Avon Historical Societies.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Rochester Avon Historical Society's Brown Bag Lunchtime program with the Rochester Hills Museum. I'm Tiffany Deserman, president of the Historical Society. And I want to thank you for joining us this afternoon, and thank you to the museum for hosting this program on Zoom. Please register for our next Brown Bag program, which is on Tuesday, December 1st, when the Society hosts Maureen Thelman and her talk on Fidelia Woolley Gillette. And you can register by visiting our website at rochesteravonhistoricalsociety.org and clicking on events. And that's all that I have to say today, so I'll hand it off to Pat.
So we're going to get started. Our program today is Rochester in the 1960s. And when I was working on this program and trying to decide, what to talk about with Rochester in the 1960s, I was amazed at, which decade I was talking about. If you would like to talk about a very controversial presidential elections or with lots of social issues going on and people rioting in the streets and lots of protests, boy, you wouldn't know if this was the 1960s or the 2020. It's and it shows us, this is what history can teach us over and over again, is that the things that we're experiencing right now, we have faced those issues before, and we have moved past them. So and they bubble back every once in a while. So I'm not saying we've ever solved all the problems, but what's going on right now is not something that's unusual. It's something that is part of, sometimes I say it's the warts with democracy sometimes, where it's very challenging. But as we go through, for those who are joining us and sometimes are not as familiar with the Rochester Hills Museum, I do a quick introduction. It's like our first date. The museum is a complex of buildings that's listed on the National Register of Historic Places, and we're very proud of our site. We do have a campus of buildings that we love, and we love to share them. Our entire museum complex is a public park, and so you're welcome to come and enjoy the grounds anytime. 24 hours a day, 365 days a year. There are no gates. You're welcome to come and enjoy and walk around. We do have the 1840s farmhouse and 1850s farmhouse. We have 16 acres of gardens and grounds. The Stony Creek Schoolhouse, built in the 1800s. You can see that a lot of our buildings are built in the 19th century. So it gets very challenging as we do everything we can to maintain these buildings and keep them in great looking shape, which means every 100 years, sometimes you have to replace the roof structures, which is what we're doing on our main building, which means it's a 10-month project that started a month ago. So not that I'm counting, but that means there's only 9 months left. So we'll be very anxious to move back. We've been in tight quarters, and with all the other challenges that went on this year. Other things that we do, we have a nice archives, and everything we do with our archival collection is to share them with you. And so we put a lot of our information online. There's a link there on our site. You can see the rochhill.org/museum, and you can look at our archives as much as you want. The really neat part and the whole premise of my presentation today is I'm pulling articles just out of the newspapers. That's really all I'm doing. I'm not trying to retell the national history of what happened in the 1960s. I'm a local history museum, so I'm just trying to do what was happening here in Rochester and how we were reacting to events going on all over the country. And you'll see that we're just a small slice of Americana. And if you would like to see the articles that I'm looking at, you're going to be able to go right on our newspapers. Now, here's the challenge. The 1960s newspapers right now have not been digitized, but they're being digitized as we speak right now. Our goal is to have them by the end of the year. It will take us 2 or 3 months to get them all uploaded onto a website. And of course, we'll make a big deal out of that when they're done. But we're digitizing our newspapers right now from 1952 to 1992 or something like that. So there's a big chunk of them that are being digitized right now, and they're going to be available for you to come and see. And then if you've not been to the museum, we do lots of displays and exhibits too, where we try and tell our story, not only the story of this fascinating family called the Taylors and the Van Hoosens who settled here, but also the story of our community that's 203 years old now. And just all the unbelievable stories that have happened in Rochester, Michigan, and we'd love to share them. So let's jump into the program. Rochester 1960s, which you'll see in a couple things. You're going to see the word Avon Township a lot. Avon Township is what we were when we started as our first form of government in roughly the 1820s, and it remained Avon Township until it incorporated as a city in 1984. That's when the vote was in November of 1984. We became the city of Rochester Hills in 1985 officially. And but you'll see the reference back to Avon Township quite a bit. Rochester has been a village since early on. They celebrate their centennial. That's going to be part of my program today in 1969, and that's when they switched from a village form of government to a city form of government. So we have two cities now that were once, a township and a village. And there's a whole story behind that, and I hardly have time to jump into all that. But what you'll see when you look in here is how rural we were. This is a very sparsely populated area. Even from 1950 to 1960, you really see a huge jump there. And boy, some of the percentages they throw out there are really, when a town grows 30% in 10 years, that's unprecedented growth. And so frequently in the Rochester area, I think it's one of the reasons why we see lots of political gnashing of teeth sometimes, is because of the pressure that was on. It was pressure on our schools, it was pressure on our roads, it was pressure on our lack of recreation properties, it was a pressure on no medical facilities, it was pressure on transportation, and that has really been happening almost every decade since the 60s, because we keep exponentially growing. I think we're finally hitting that plateau right now. But in the 1960s, we were roughly at 26,000 people. Today, we say 2010, that's our last census. The 2020 census is just going to be coming out soon, so we'll be able to update this. But we've gone from roughly 25,000 people in 1960s to probably 125,000 people. As we start looking at what happened now. So our towns have grown dramatically. So as we look at the Rochester Village Council, and we'll keep calling it a village because it's not until the end of the decade, 1969, when they finally became a city. And some of the names you see, these are the leaders of our community. You see the Roy Rewald, which, who owned and operated Frank Rewald and Son, which is one of the major builders in our community. You see names like Don Pixley with Pixley Funeral Home that's been here, and John Bobritz was heavily involved and worked at National Twist Drill, which is at the corner of Tinkin and Rochester. I'm going to talk about that facility a little bit. These are the leaders of our community. And then you hear the struggles that they had about whether they should become, or if Rochester should go from a village to a city. And this is some really interesting articles. You see the upper corner, it says in 1962. And as they debated this, and they had a steering committee, so it was a citizen-driven initiative. But you'll see here the Clarence Patterson speaking on behalf of Park Davis. Now, Park Davis is a major person to talk about, a major company to talk about, because they're the largest employer in the Rochester area. Between them and National Twist Drill are probably the two largest. And they have said, in this article, it says Park Davis has announced his opposition to the incorporation several months ago. It has long-range plans for developing the biological farms, and vast areas are necessary for this future expansion. They did not want to go, and they even used the word, it's interesting, that Patterson said that Park Davis is violently opposed to the inclusion of this land in the city. As Rochester was converting from being a village to a city, the tax rates were going to change. And so suddenly, everybody's taxes were going to go up, and the businesses did not want to see their taxes go up. Is that a common thread, a common story? It was lots of gnashing of teeth. It's a big decision when a community changes their form of government, whether it's from a village to a city or from a township to a city. And I, certainly in a 45-minute program, it's hard to cover all that. But the newspapers carried it over and over again. Is the time ripe for cityhood? And they just keep going over and over again about what city law, state law, and what it means, and how big of a community you have to be. And the only reason Rochester really bumped up against this issue is because it was growing so much. People were moving to the suburbs. Because the roads were improving, we were able to live in Rochester and in Avon Township and work in Detroit. And so what happened? What happened to allow that to happen? Well, Rochester Road got improved, and I-75 got improved. So those are the big things. That whole interstate system that was built in the 1950s after World War II, boy, it certainly affected Rochester. And it's really one of the reasons why Rochester, I think, is a thriving community today, is because we have great transportation. And you'll think about that every time you pass an orange barrel and orange cone. But they finally, in 1967 is when Rochester finally became the city. And then all the challenges. You have to select a new mayor. And there were some issues between the township and the city. One of them being Mount Avon Cemetery. Mount Avon Cemetery was owned and operated by the city of Avon Township at that point. And the village wanted to take that over. And so there was a transfer of the Mount Avon Cemetery. Also, the Rochester Municipal Park was an Avon Park. And so they also switched. So the ownership and operation was transferred from Avon Township to the city of Rochester. And we have a whole story on the evolution of the Rochester Municipal Park. I think we all love it, and it's a cool location in downtown Rochester. But there were lots of issues and thousands of hours of meetings, I'm sure, and attorneys made a fortune in trying to figure out how to do that. So, and then you'll see the crest, and all the exciting things that happened. There's a new flag, and this crest that you see, 1869 to 1969, is exactly the same crest that they have today. They have 4 symbols on the flag, and those 4 symbols are symbolically represented in some interpretive signs that are scattered around the community. The torch talks about education, so there's a sign over by the Rochester Community Schools Administration Building. The hammer and the sickle on the lower left corner is about industry, and there's a sign over by the Western Knitting Mill by the Frank Rewald and Son new building. The one on the upper right with the oak leaves is over on Ludlow Street along the sidewalk at the municipal park. And the one with the castle look is about government, and it's in front of Rochester City Hall. So it's a fun thing to walk around town and kind of check that out. And then you see Rochester Hills going through the same thing. Avon Township was looking at also becoming a city. And so, I just mentioned that the election to approve it was in 1984. But look at these headlines. In 1968, they're talking about whether Avon Township should become a city as opposed to a township. It is, certainly wasn't the only place this was happening. Sterling Heights was Sterling Township. Auburn Hills was Pontiac Township, and they became the city. And so it's happened throughout Southeast Michigan. And what it happens when you have a city government, city governments can annex portions of townships. And so that's one of the huge one of the huge beefs, I guess, that have happened in our community is when Rochester became a city, they annexed a big chunk of Avon Township. And that portion that they took included the largest taxpayer in Avon Township, Park Davis Pharmaceutical Company and Parkdale Biological Farms. So there was some heated rivalry between that because of what was happening. And then the city of Troy, which was Troy Township, as they became a city, they wanted to annex Avon Township all the way up to South Boulevard. And then as Auburn Hills was becoming a city, Pontiac was looking at annexing a portion, and they were looking at taking parts of Avon Township all the way to Adams Road. And one by one, everybody was gobbling up Avon Township. And Avon Township wanted to be, more self-governing than allowing other places to come and take over. So, and as you can see, Avon turns down the charter. So it did not pass. Rochester became a city in 1967. In 1969, it still wasn't happening. And it wasn't going to happen in the 1970s, and it wasn't going to happen until the mid 1980s. So it's kind of interesting. So then at some point you say, well, wait a minute, you got towns of Rochester and Rochester Hills. I can't even keep them straight. So why don't we just unify these 2 communities and make it one town? Call it Rochester or call it Rochester Hills or whatever you want. And that has been going on. So know that you're not the first one to ask that question. That has been going on for probably 60 years. People have talked about that. I'm aware of at least 4 times it went to the ballot. And one time it passed by one community, not the other. And the next time it would be, they would switch, and the community that didn't vote for it voted for it, and the other one didn't. And then the last one, both communities voted it down. And it's the reasons why we have 2 separate communities today. So, is it a good idea? So certainly, people look at that saying, it's certainly some replication of government services. Other people say, this is how democracy works, is where you have more control as a voter on what happens in your backyard. You don't have, a bigger regional area doing it. And yet, bigger regional areas run a little more efficiently. So never-ending battle. I don't want to take care of that. I don't want to nail that conversation right now because it gets very political, and I'm going to try and stay neutral. So ultimately, here's the question. Why was there explosive growth in the Rochester area in the 1960s? What's the number one reason? not looking at that and saying, well, gosh, was there a business that opened? Was it the expressway that finally opened? And you boil it all down, and it comes down to some pretty simple things. It comes down to utilities. For the most part, for any kind of business or any kind of major residential building, schools, hospitals, they all rely on utilities. So it's all about utilities, and more, it's sewer and water. And so I always say that the reason why our communities exploded with growth in the 1960s was because of sewer lines. When the sewer lines were built out from Detroit, because Avon Township, for the most part, businesses and houses and subdivisions use common septic tanks and wells, and that's where they got their water. And that has a limited capacity at some point. And then you realize what that also means for your local waterways. Think about what happens suddenly when everybody's on a septic system, and you have the Clinton River, Payne Creek, and Stony Creek. And in this town, at some point in the 1960s, we got really serious about ecology. And I'm going to show you some slides here that are a little bit disturbing about how polluted these areas were. And finally, people woke up and said, this isn't right. Rochester did have their own sewage system and their own sewage treatment plant, which still stands. It's just not being used anymore. The access to it is off of the trailhead on the Clinton River Trail, right by the OPC on Letica Drive. And there's a driveway that goes back to the sewage treatment plant. And they don't use that anymore. All the sewage in Rochester now is tied into the Detroit sewer system. So we are tied regionally now to that system. But it's all about water and sewer. And it's look at the size of some of these sewer lines that are coming in here. We're not talking minor sewer lines. The water lines, that feed Detroit city water that go out into Lake Huron. I mean, you can take your car and drive down those water pipes. So that's how big those water pipes are. They're monster pipes. And so the city of Detroit then takes that water, they treat it, and then they distribute it out to about millions of people in southeast Michigan, all the way out to Shelby Township. Shelby Township sells their water to the city of Rochester. Rochester Hills has their own water lines coming in. So there is always work going on those. Right now, I think South Boulevard is closed at Coolidge because of a water line. They're improving some water lines there. And we take water for granted until you get a situation like the Flint water crisis, where suddenly your water is not safe to drink, and it changes everything. But anyways, it's water and sewer, probably more than anything. And I mentioned briefly about what it takes about the expressways, and these were some big headlines here, where a 125-mile section of the I-75 freeway was open to traffic, and they completed that 35-mile-long Pontiac to Flint freeway. So how did you go up north when you didn't have I-75 going from the Rochester area up to Bay City and all that? You were taking US 23, or you were taking 2-lane roads all the way up there. So I-75 was started in the 1950s coming out of Detroit. And expressways did terrible things in our from a historic standpoint. Wiped out huge swaths of historic neighborhoods and all that. And even these the pictures you see in the middle with all the earth movers, they're getting ready to build M59. So it was really one of the biggest changes in our town is when the sewer line came, and that allowed us to start growing. Crittenton Hospital is a great story for us. They were excited about it. And you think about where Crittenton Hospital is today. When you look at this one, it says that the initial location was going to be, I'm trying to find it on the article I'm reading right now, because I just was reading it this morning. It was at the corner of John R. and Auburn Road. And that's what even this article talks about. That they're not only trying to move the hospital that existed in downtown Detroit, but the 1960s, there was a lot of people moving out. Some people would call that white flight, is when more white people were moving out of Detroit into the suburbs. And part of it is they could, because the expressways allowed them to live outside in this big open fresh air. Some people were moving because of racial issues and the African-American populations in Detroit. There's all kinds of different reasons, but Crittenton Hospital was looking at the same thing. They were looking at a new suburban location. And the hospital that they abandoned in downtown Detroit is still standing. It's Cass Community Social Services is down there today, and some of the exact same buildings. So they're still there. But when they were moving out here, coincidentally, there was another effort to build a hospital here called the Bertha Van Hoosen Hospital. That's one of our namesakes here at the Rochester Hills Museum. And the Bertha Van Hoosen Hospital organization and the Crittenden Hospital organization merged their efforts to build a hospital here. But here you can see that they were fundraising, going to people like me and you, asking us to donate money to build a hospital. So, you know, but not one penny can be received from these two sources until you, the citizens who will benefit from the institution, provide your full share. More than $800,000 towards this goal has been subscribed to date. The remainder is in your hands. Boy, that puts some pressure on it. And then I love the ad on the side. Our children and theirs in turn will look upon our labors and the wrought substance thereof and say, this is our father did. They brought a hospital to town, and boy, aren't we lucky to have Ascension Providence Rochester Hospital here today. It's not only is it one of the big employers of our town, but heck, it's really nice when you have a hospital right around the corner. As I say, I delivered my 4 daughters and my appendix were all delivered at Crittenden Hospital. So I'm glad to know that they're right here in town. And then at some point they did change that location. It didn't go from John R. Auburn area. I think it's roughly as they were looking at the corner where the Salvation Army is on the northwest corner of John R. and Auburn. And when Howard McGregor decided to donate the land where it is today at Walton and Livernois, that's when Crittenden Hospital, where it was able to pivot a little bit, and they suddenly had the ability to pull this hospital together because they didn't have to acquire the land. What a great picture. When you see horses, here you see exactly what's going on in the 1960s. We're transferring from a rural community to a very, very, very suburban community. And after 3 years of fundraising, they're going to go, the sign says 200 beds, but it's not going to be 200 beds. It's going to be 211 beds. So here they are, and this is where Crittenden Hospital is today. And here you see it, you know, this is some of the designs. They've added onto it many, many, many times, like you see in every hospital. And we've been fortunate. We've got great, it's a stroke center, it's a cardiac center. It does everything, and we're lucky to have that in our town. But, you know, and then on top of that, look at all the other challenges we have here. The darn railroads are setting fires all the time as they come through town. Remember, we have 2 train tracks crisscrossing town. So by the 1960s, that wasn't working very well because these giant fields would catch on fire, and guess what's right around them? The subdivisions. And so now you got like a Southern California issue where you got, you know, field fires sweeping into subdivisions. And so the challenges are challenges that we do not have today. The other really great thing that happened to us in the 1960s was Oakland University. And Oakland University was really, you know, we're so fortunate in our town that as much as we like to pat all of our government leaders on the back, and they've done remarkable things to bring wonderful resources to our town to be successful, philanthropy has certainly done its share too. Oakland University is a classic example of philanthropy. The Rochester Hills Public Library is as a result of philanthropy. Avon Players is a result of philanthropy. Bloomer Park is a result of philanthropy, donations. And so Oakland University was a gift from Matilda Wilson. I'm going to have some other pictures about that coming up there. But it was known as Michigan State University, Oakland. Matilda Wilson and coincidentally Sarah Van Hoosen Jones were both on the board of trustees at Michigan State University. And when Matilda decided what to do with her farm, you know, she was sitting on a 1,600-acre farm and donated that and $2 million to build a university in our town. And holy cow, aren't we lucky to have not only a hospital, we have Oak University in our town. It's all because of philanthropy. And it was known as MSUO, and then it grew up, and it changed its name then to Oakland University. And still, if you're you know, in the library, I remember when I was a student at Oakland, I would still see books that were stamped MSUO. I thought that was really cool. And because I knew I had an old book in my hand at that point. And now it is an independent university. It's independent from Michigan State too. It's not part of MSU. But there are still some links there, I think. You know, we have the Michigan State University Federal Credit Union, which is right over there. And so it's all there. And then, you know, you just see the booming building that started then in the 1960s with Oak University. Here you see the foundation halls that are being built, and $4.3 million. And they expected this enrollment bulge. You know, and honestly, when you look in the last 2 or 3 years at the universities in Michigan that have increasing enrollment, because almost all of them are decreasing enrollment. The increasing enrollments, I think, are Michigan State, and Oakland University. Those are the 3 that are still growing and have more people. Nearly every other university is shrinking their population. And then all the little things, like they brought computers to Oakland University, 1960s. Imagine how big those computer rooms were. They probably had a whole room that still doesn't have as much memory as a laptop that some of you might be watching this on, or the phone that you're holding in your hand. You know, national news was affecting us too. What was happening in the country certainly affected people in Rochester. And, you know, the Cuban Missile Crisis was a huge threat. Now, the Cold War is going on. You know, our Cold War congressman at this point is Congressman William S. Broomfield, who's a great friend of the museums. His ancestors settled the Stony Creek area where our museum is located. Mr. Broomfield passed away about 2 years ago, but we call him our Cold War congressman because he was in Congress representing us during this time. And there were lots of programs going on locally. This is how people got their news. You know, it wasn't by Zoom, and it wasn't by you know, faxes. You couldn't read your emails. You got the newspaper, and then if you were a member of Kiwanis, and the reason why people belong to these social and fraternal organizations is that you could meet, and this is where you got your information. Even in the 1960s, you were doing this. So, and then, you know, we started coming up with civil defense, and what do we do when those missiles are coming in? And, you know, we think wearing a mask, you know, all day long, and all the precautions we're taking there is the worst thing that's ever happened to us. Imagine the worry you have when, you know, you're afraid missiles are going to be coming in. And, you know, then at some point you can see the headline newspaper in the Rochester Clarion after President Kennedy had been assassinated. And it's interesting because we do have, you know, local people with connections to the president. Rad Jones is a retired Secret Service agent who lives in Oakland Township. He's one of the nicest guys you've ever met, but he was on the Kennedy detail. He wasn't there that day in Dallas. His wife was in labor and he was home with her. His partner was the one that was jumping on the back of the limousine after the president had been shot. And he has, you know, incredible stories that talk about, you know, the efforts that the Secret Service, you know, puts into protecting the president. But we were surrounded by the Cold War, and this was a very scary thing to go through. The Cuban Missile Crisis was very serious. And also there were efforts to put missiles in Rochester to defend Southeast Michigan. There was a ring of batteries all around Southeast Michigan to protect Detroit. They thought that would be the largest target. A lot of them were called the Nike missiles. Nike is a Greek goddess for victory. And so there was one over in Shelby Township on off Auburn Road and Woodall Road. There was also one on, today would be on the Oakland Community College campus. And there was another missile defense system that was proposed for the Rochester area. And let's just say that the people in Rochester were not very happy about this. It would have gone in on basically a 1 square mile area that would have been bounded by Avon Road to Hamlin Road and Rochester Road to Livernois, section 22 in our city. They would have had to have excavated down. The missiles were going to be about 60 feet down in the ground. So it wasn't a Nike missile, it was a different missile system. Off the top of my head, I can't remember it. What I need to look is at this newspaper article again, but boy, they would hold these meetings. And it's interesting that the military, you know, still held meetings and allowed the public, you know, in a democracy to say, we don't want it. And they did, and it was turned down. It was never installed here, as we all know. And then you look at these pictures and you say, well, gosh, you know, civil unrest, people upset, you know, people very divided on different U.S. presidents. You know, is it George Romney? Is it Nelson Rockefeller? And this is going on at Rochester High School in 1962. So it's almost reassuring sometimes to see these headlines because I know we'll be okay. When, you know, the COVID thing's going to go away because polio went away. We saw what Rochester did with the polio vaccine. You know, we don't hear about anybody doing that. And you know, there's shots now for everything from diphtheria to measles and mumps and smallpox. And, you know, so these are just little blips in life. And this is just going to be a very interesting story. You know, 2 years from now, I'm going to be doing a program on COVID and how we handled COVID. And we're going to say, oh, yeah, remember we all wore those masks that were terrible. I hated them. Yep, we're going to be doing that too. So somebody someday is going to be able to talk about the things that we're going through right now. In education, our town was bursting. Not only were we bursting with people and businesses, but children. And so as children were moving into town, we needed schools. And we needed elementary schools, we needed middle schools, we needed high schools. The high schools needed pools and they needed gymnasiums, we needed universities, and the challenges and the money that was necessary. You can imagine what's happening. You know, they have to go to the voters and keep saying, we need another, you know, $3 million to keep building these. And Woody Varner, you know, there's a Varner Hall on campus at Oak University. Woody Varner is here and was pleading with the city of Rochester with the Rochester Community Schools to develop a high quality educational system. So, because it's very important to Oak University. Those students are going to go to school at Oak University. And I'm sure, Rochester students are still a big portion of the attendance at Oakland University. So he was attending as a university representative to the Rochester School Board, saying, you got to make sure you're up in your game so that your students can come to college. Otherwise, it's a waste of our time to have you guys here. And it's a waste of time for Oak University to develop without the local support of the community here. So, so over and over again, you look at these numbers, a $500,000 for a $7.3 million school expansion. They need a swimming pool and they need auditoriums, 1,000 people, and things are just booming. And so, what was happening in Rochester was everybody just saying, yes, absolutely. No, they were not. It was rejected. And this happened over and over again. And so, it's just like it happens now. The proposals would be pared down a little bit smaller, and they were at the next election, they were there asking for money again and doing it. And 106 vote margin, rejects the pool auditorium bonding. That was going to be for Rochester High School. So in 1965, we only have one high school at that time, but we need another one. And so, so imagine the concern you have when you're the school board officials and you're trying to expand your high school, knowing that you need a whole new high school, and you can't get voters to even do additions on their building. So, and this actually ran all the way into the mid-1990s. The mid-1990s, at one point, we needed our third high school. And so they went, the school board went in front of the voters and said, listen, we need a new high school and a new elementary school, Musson Elementary, and Stony Creek High School. We need a bond issue, and it was defeated. And so they pared it down, went back, and by 5 votes, it was approved. And that's what built Musson Elementary School and Stony Creek High School, a 5-vote margin. So you see this record turnout we had this week on Tuesday on votes, and boy, that's really important. But, then by 1967, you see that this Tinkin Adams site, we know that name, that's Adams High School. A lot of our schools are named by the streets they're on, Brewster Elementary and all those things. So, a second senior high school, they were buying land, starting to get ready for this, swelling population that we had here. The other part is our town was going through urban renewal. And I say the 1960s was the worst decade when it comes to historic preservation in our town. And that's only seconded by just about every decade since then. Our historic buildings dropped one by one. And this is a vastly different looking town today than it was in 1960, vastly different. We wouldn't recognize the town because of the new construction that's gone in. And this is the picture you see, the picture of the St. James Hotel. It says doomed, and it was torn down. Today, that's right in the corner of Main and University. Today, Bean and Leaf, the coffee shop, is in that location. The entire building was removed. It was a wood-framed hotel, at a time when the railroad came in, and we actually had hotels on Main Street. And when the railroads left, so did the hotels. And then on the left, you see the guys putting up the Christmas decorations, a little bit different than the Christmas decorations we see today in Rochester with all the lights and all that. People say they just loved these ones that strung across the road. It looks a little chintzy to me. I kind of like what we have now, but I don't want to digress. And then I know some of our beautiful houses. This is the Chapman House, and it was located on North Main Street, right next to St. Philip's Episcopal Church. I always say kitty corner from the Dairy Queen. Everybody knows where the Dairy Queen is, on Romeo Road and Rochester Road. But just south of that intersection was a beautiful house. It was a house designed by Albert Kahn, one of the preeminent architects of Detroit. And he didn't do many residential homes. He did mostly factories for Henry Ford, but he built this one. It was a spectacular home owned by the Chapman family. The Chapmans, there were 2 brothers, and one of them had this beautiful house. The other one had the Chapman House. That's on Walnut Boulevard, which was a restaurant, but is sitting empty right now. It's right next to the brunch house. Beautiful, beautiful house there too. So these 2 brothers were doing pretty well. They owned and operated the Western Knitting Mill, which is where Rochester Mills Beer Company is. So you can see the kind of money these guys would have had. And unfortunately, after the Chapmans were not living there anymore, it turned into a senior citizen residence and a nursing home, and then eventually it was torn down. The only thing left is this big stone pillar right in the front, still standing right along the sidewalk. A little tiny sign there that brings some information to it. And then the Mill Pond project is interesting. At one point in the center of downtown, we had a gigantic mill pond. 1946, that pond, the dam broke, and that pond drained. So from 1946 till 1965, so we're talking 20 years, it was an overgrown, muddy mess. You know, you can think about this, what Midland is going through right now. You know, they had a big giant mill pond and people lived on it and the houses all around, beautiful recreational lakes. And those lakes drained in May this year. And I'm sure their long-term plan is to rebuild those dams. In Rochester, it wasn't necessary to rebuild that dam. That dam was built to provide water power for the Western Knitting Mill. The Western Knitting Mill wasn't using water power anymore by the 1940s. They were using electricity, and electricity was a lot more efficient, a lot more effective, a lot more reliable. And so the mill pond area just sat empty with weeds and debris and everything there. And so for 20 years it sat until it was redeveloped. And here we see the Elks Lodge, the developer, they all pushed the mill pond project. The Elks Lodge eventually was demolished, and that's where the Royal Park Hotel is. But in this map, you can kind of see where this mill pond was, now where the library is, the post office, and the Royal Park Hotel. And aren't we lucky that this area has been redeveloped? I don't think we would hardly recognize it today, to do that. And then I know the exciting headlines. 1969, Avon population gained 4,000 people. That's significant. And then we did have the remnants of the train was still there. The train went somewhere, I would roughly say where Old Town Road is, which goes in front of the library and the post office. And this is where the Purple Pickle restaurant was. The Purple Pickle was in a series of train cars, and you would walk up and down them. I grew up in Utica, and we had a big giant historic home in downtown that was, of course, painted purple and was also called the Purple Pickle. So I like to say that word about 30 times as fast as you can. Transportation, this is another big thing that's going on here is what was going on. We still had trains going through here. And this is really one of the most disturbing articles I think I've ever read. First of all, I'm delighted that they're putting some efforts into making the trains safer. And what this article is talking about is just chain link fence here. They're trying to get people to not walk on the train track. So, if you haven't driven by Yates Cider Mill, drive by it any single day in the fall and see what's going on there. There's thousands and thousands of people all over the place. Well, right now we don't even have a train tracks going through there, thank goodness. And in this article, they talk about the reason why they had to do this. And I'm going to read this to you, and I apologize if I find myself doing this all the time. But it says the fence blocks off the railroad from the parking lot and flashers have been erected. In October of 1961, a Clawson woman and her 2 children were trapped on the railroad bridge when the B line approached. That's one of the trains. One child jumped, the mother threw the other off the bridge, and she was killed by the train. I just can't even fathom that article. It's just hard to believe that these kinds of things were happening in Rochester in 1961. So I'm glad to see that the trains they were trying to come up with some safety things, and finally added some flashers. Some of you may remember that. Of course, we're always looking for those. If you have stories, I think Kathy mentioned, you can type things into the chat box if you remember crazy stories in our history. But at some point, of course, the train tracks have all disappeared. Trains were not even in Rochester for 100 years. They were gone. They came in the 1870s, gone in the 1960s. And in fact, that's coming up on one of my next few slides. And, we know these train tracks now as the Paint Creek Trail and the Clinton River Trail. So, but nice to know that they were making some efforts. The other really huge challenge was the lack of train signals, our traffic signals. This is the intersection of Rochester and Tinkin. This big this big chain link fence up here with barbed wire on the top of it is the Twist Drill property. And the Twist Drill property, through the 1940s had a sharpshooter on the roof during the World War II to protect that building in case enemy saboteurs came to it. So there was guard shacks on top of that building with guys with rifles with scopes and dogs patrolling the outer limits of it. And so the fence is still standing. And at some point what this article is, you start seeing the newspapers taking some little positions here, and this is another terrible accident. It says, it took 5 men to restrain one of the victims to get him into the ambulance. I don't know what happened there. I can't imagine it take 5 people to hold somebody down. And the newspapers are saying, there's no flasher or traffic signal. This is at Tinkin and Rochester. There's no traffic signal at the crossing, despite years of effort by the township and citizens. The roads, when you're not a city, the roads are run by either the state or the county. which is still the case in that intersection. You know, Tinkin Road is a county road, Rochester Road is a state road. So, you know, the efforts, you can't just, you know, make your own decisions. And so there was no traffic signal. You looked left, you looked right, and you gun it. And realize that there are three shifts a day working at the twist drill. So every 8 hours, there's a whole change of 1,400 people. And so this town would get very busy every 8 hours when shift change. And it was some really challenging. And then they were even saying, hey, I know, why don't we pave Tinkin Road? And this is the cry to get it, to pave it between Livernois and Rochester Road, pave Tinkin Road. So imagine, and that didn't happen until the 1990s. I hope that's not right. Until the late 1970s, I think it finally got paved. And then, you know, the end of the train era came here in the 1960s. The last steam engine came, and when it came, just as a ceremonial, you know, last run, they had to bring the fire trucks out here to load water into these trains. You know, they ran on there, you know, that's why you'd see these big giant tanks of water at every train stop, because the trains had to fill up with water. You know, they were steam, they weren't coal. And so kind of exciting. And then you start seeing, you know, this is part of that mill development project. The Royal Park Hotel is right off to the left here. And this is the bridge that goes across Paint Creek. This little condo building still there today. A post office is up there. Library's off to the right. But you see, you know, this is going up towards Elizabeth Street. But you just see East University was finally being built in the 1960s. You know, it ended by the Rochester elevator, because that road was called Water Street, and that's where the water was, right on the other side of the elevator. And so from the elevator all the way up to Elizabeth Street was water. It was a pond. So, and then from a recreation standpoint, Stony Creek Metro Park was coming. You know, this whole idea of saying, listen, we should be setting aside some land. And we should be thinking, you know, when you start thinking about what it takes to run a community, it's more than just schools and hospitals. You know, you got to be thinking about recreation and facilities for senior citizens. And they were going through this. And here's the biggest challenge Stony Creek Metro Park had. What do you do with their sewage? They didn't, a 3,300 acre park, and they wanted to open it in 1964, but they didn't have a way of getting rid of their sewage. And why, you know, they obviously didn't want to build their own sewage treatment plant. So the sewage it's an interesting story. It came out of Stony Creek Metro Park. At some point, it came down right past the Rochester Hills Museum, right underneath Runyon Road. From Runyon Road, it turned and went between our building up Romeo Road. And then as it went up the hill, there was a sewage lift station that was there until, you know, in the 1990s. And they were taking it all the way to the Village of Rochester sewage treatment plant. And so that's how they got rid of it until today. I'm not sure what they do. All the sewage ends up at the city of Detroit, and because they have, you know, Detroit Sewer and Water is really what handles most of the sewage in Southeast Michigan. So you probably have heard the word water and sewage more in this talk than anywhere else. But boy, oh boy, you just can't have development until you bring that infrastructure in. And so, you know, Stony Creek Metro Park. Can you imagine life without Stony Creek? You know, if you've not been up there, you know, it's a phenomenal park and we're just so lucky to have it. You know, could they build it today? I'm going to guess no. You know, and I'm not sure they could have had the permission now to build a dam, flood wetlands, and create a recreation area. So it happened, and I think we're lucky to have it. Locally, though, right in downtown Rochester, this is the municipal park and the pond right behind Rochester City Hall, and everybody's skating on it. It looks like they're skating wherever they want. This does not happen anymore. They do shovel off areas where you can skate, but this whole left end of the pond does not freeze. And so these kids are walking up this little gangplank, and they're walking up to the Kiwanis, or the Lions Club has a warming house there. So once again, thanks to the Rochester Lions Club for building these great park facilities for us. Unfortunately, that end of the park doesn't freeze anymore. So you can't get to the warming shelter anymore. You'd have to walk on concrete sidewalks all the way around the pond. For some reason, it just doesn't freeze that end. There's some pipes moving water in there, but so it's just interesting to see the scenes. This is New Year's Day. It's fun to see everybody out there having a great time, enjoying our parks. And then here's another park. You see Thelma Spencer, and yep, this is the same Thelma Spencer as Spencer Park that we have over on John R. Road and M59 Expressway. Thelma Spencer was a long time resident of Rochester Hills and employee, and I had a chance to work with her and know her very well. And If there's anybody deserving to have a park named after him, it would be Thelma Spencer. She was the nicest person ever. From the environment standpoint, yeah, there were issues. Paint Creek had some terrible pollution. One of the key people that really stepped up was Walter Reuther. And we know Walter Reuther is a UAW organizer, and he lived on Paint Creek up in Oakland Township. And he would go door to door with people saying, make sure your septic tank is not leaking into Paint Creek. And I'm sure he had a way of convincing people to make sure that took place. But nonetheless, there were efforts here. And they were really hammering on Orion Township and the city of Lake Orion. Here you see the village of Lake Orion has been asked to appear and explain why it's so polluted. In fact, last summer, it says, the last sentence, the last summer, the township was asked by the health department to halt swimming in Paint Creek in the Avon Township Park due to pollution. So this is in the Rochester Municipal Park. You could no longer swim there because it was so heavily polluted. So at some point, the state of Michigan went in and killed every single fish in there. They poisoned the water intentionally with the idea that, listen, we're going to clean up this river. It's moving water. So once you stop the sources of pollution, you have an opportunity to get clean water in there. And they're going to start introducing trout. And today, Paint Creek is one of the finest trout streams in the state of Michigan. And it's just so accessible to everyone. I think a lot of people, if you want to see the greatest trout stream in the United States, it's probably the AuSable River up in northern Michigan. I'm telling you, shoulder to shoulder is Paint Creek right here in our town. And it's heavily used, heavily populated, and yet we're still able to maintain a trout fishery in Paint Creek. So we're really lucky that, we have so many good organizations like the Clinton River Watershed Council. And I'll tell you, we're fortunate that people have stepped up. And I tell this story, and I firmly believe it. And in Rochester, when we needed people, nobody stepped backward to say, I'm too busy, I'm too overwhelmed, I don't have the skill set. People stepped forward and said, I will do it, I will help out. And they did. And that's why we have these phenomenal water sources, because I don't know if I could tolerate having a heavily polluted, creek going right through our community. Here's one of my favorite stories. It's 1967. You talk about the family, the Newman family, and they have 3 sets of twins. Hey, and you probably know one of the twins. Her name is Karen Newman. Karen Newman sings the national anthem at all the Red Wings games. And Karen is standing over here on the right. This is Karen Newman. And what a coincidence. And she had children. She had a set of twins. So twins seem to run in the family. So I'm going to read this caption because it's just so much fun. It says, Rochester's only 3 twin family posed for pictures after Mr. Ralph Newman, 722 West University Drive, arrived home from the hospital last weekend with the newest arrivals. From left are Mr. Newman with baby Peter, twins Christy and Carolyn, 5-year-old Kurt, twins Catherine and Karen, and Mrs. Newman with baby Patricia. The new set was born at 6/12 and 6/17 on New Year's Day. A friend from Illinois is assisting the family this week. I hope they stay for a long time. Said Mr. Newman to the photographer as he passed out a cigar, we don't think you'll have to come back next year. I'm not sure exactly what that means, but celebrating the Newman family. We've had a chance to meet Karen Newman. She's been here before asking for newspaper articles that talked about her family and on the front page. And sure enough, we had that newspaper. So it was fun to celebrate. And then you just start seeing the names, Howard McGregor. We know the McGregor name. You've heard of McGregor Elementary School. And the McGregors owned Great Oak Stock Farm and donated the land to build Crittenden Hospital and led the fundraising effort to build a hospital, was the first chairman of the board at Crittenden Hospital. And here you see pictures of him giving money to, at that point it was called Michigan Christian College, but just to encourage these universities to establish themselves in Rochester. These are the things that you can build on in a community when you have universities. And you just see how often we were lucky to have people. And here's Mrs. Wilson. And Mrs. Wilson, they talk about campus hijinks. In Oakland University, they didn't have a football team, have never had one. So they didn't really have homecoming. You know what the big event was? Her birthday. So in the fall, they celebrated that. And so in 1965, she was 81 years old and soon to turn 82. I think that's the way it works. And the students honor each year like the homecoming of the nation's #1 team. So Mrs. Wilson was the center of attention, and they would cover her birthday. It was a phenomenal gift that she gave to our community. And then, I have to throw something in for our own Dr. Sarah Van Hoosen Jones. She was very involved at Crittenden Hospital, and I don't know how, was it heartbreaking to her when the hospital changed the name and was not going to be called Bertha Van Hoosen Hospital? I think we You know what, I've been fighting this battle for a long time. Not take for granted the name Bertha Van Hoosen, probably one of the most remarkable doctors and surgeons in the world through the 1950s. And now it's a long time since the 1950s, so we forget the accomplishments and what these people have done. Sarah Van Hoosen Jones didn't want that to happen. There is I don't know what Florida is now, where all the babies are born. It probably has changed since I was there 21 years ago with our last baby, but that's the OBGYN floor is where it's named the Bertha Van Hoosen floor, but I'm not even sure if they still reference that. But here, this is a picture of Sarah Van Hoosen Jones donating 500 copies of Petticoat Surgeon to the Crittenton Hospital Auxiliary. If you've never read Petticoat Surgeon, shame on you. You need to read that book. It's one of the most remarkable books you'll ever read in your life. And I've said this for 35 years. I'll say it again. If you don't like the book, I'll buy it back from you. So nobody's ever taken me up on that offer. And then we have some great people. John Boveritz, we see that name pop up over and over again. In 1976, during the bicentennial, John Boveritz was the one leading the cause and really loved local history, and just seems like a nice guy, really working hard to preserve our own community's history. And then, we have the sadness of the Vietnam War going on, where once again, we're sending our young men and women off to war. And it's being well covered in our newspapers. They're making sure that our soldiers are being recognized. And then we're worried about the riots in Detroit in the 1960s, people are aware of it and what's coming up here. And then other facilities, what's being built around, the Christian Memorial Cemetery is being built, and that's where right behind Bourdines was being constructed. And then Avon Players is being constructed. Sarah Van Hoosen Jones donated property to build Avon Players. Boy, all of a sudden you start seeing these facilities that we have and you realize they're all in the 1960s. The 525-acre farm, Section 22, remember? That's where they were going to build the missile defense system. So it's between Avon and Hamlin Road and Livernois and Rochester Road. These are huge operations and huge commercial developments. The huge office commercial project with the bridge over Walton never happened, but it was going to go roughly from the Crittenton Hospital side over to what was then Great Oaks Mall. And, they did build Great Oaks Mall, and they never built a bridge over Walton Boulevard. Bourdines, greatly expanded. Pixley Funeral Home, greatly expanded. And then this town knew how to throw in a good time and have fun. And there were lots of things. Probably one of the most beloved was floatable boatables. We saw that going on. Our churches greatly expanded here. The Lutherans, St. John Lutheran Church, dedicated a new organ, but then the Catholics got involved and they were going to build St. Irenaeus Church, which is on Old Perch Road. And then St. John's was going to add on to their building and greatly expand onto it. They're located right next to Crittenton Hospital. And then St. Andrew Catholic Church was also moving and building a whole new church there and building a convent for nuns. That's the convent building still stands. But the Methodists kept right up. St. Paul's Methodist expanded. These are all in the 1960s. So you just see it over and over again, how important it was. And then our town has always been changed by fire. And it's amazing how often a building would burn down and then, be rebuilt right back up. One of my favorite stories is coming right up here. You see the major fires going on, kids playing with matches. We see this over and over again, but there's one great story I found in the Brooklands Fire Department. I'm going to read this very, very quickly. 6 young men who thought it would be delightful entertainment to see fire trucks in action got their wish, but they had to pay for the show. So basically they discovered, they recognized the boys at the scene, and they were questioned. Spied near the fire were 6 youths looking on. The firemen summoned the sheriff's department. They converged on the area. The boys admitted to the prank. 4 of the boys were from East Detroit and 1 from Rochester and 1 from Warren. Because none of the boys had been in trouble before, the deputies and firemen decided to let the boys off if they completed one task that night: to wash and polish the 2 fire trucks. It took them 2 hours to finish the job. Oh my God, what a great time. And then, at 1969, we celebrate the centennial from 1869 to 1969, and there was monster parties going on in downtown Rochester. Descendants of Stony Creek came out and they dedicated. We still have this rock and a plaque in the front yard of the Van Hoosen farmhouse still there. And you see the parades, and there was quite a celebration recognizing it. And in 1967, September 9th, 1967, there's an effort, and the first time we start seeing that, hey, it's time to actually start a history museum in this town because people seem to love it. And I'm glad to know that, 20 years later, they finally got around to it. When you start looking at, our ads here, and you see our population growing 23% in 5 years. This is a town that was bursting in 1960s. And then you look at it and say, wow, what could possibly happen in the 1970s or 1980s? And that's another program we'd love to do. So thank you for joining us. As Tiffany said, both of our organizations rely on memberships. We would love to have you do that. It's how we do capital improvements, which is major rebuilding of barns. We frequently are, we put money into a pot and can match it sometimes with grants, but those pots grow to be thousands of dollars that allow us to digitize our newspapers and rebuild barns. So we hope maybe during this season of giving, as we approach Thanksgiving and Christmas, you'll consider our organizations and help us out. So with that, I'll turn it back over to Kathy. I don't know if there's any questions we have. Know that you can always send questions, or if you'd like to know more about anything I talked about today, happy to share. Everything we have, we're happy to give away to you. Thanks for sharing. We don't have another brown bag lunch scheduled until next year, and that schedule will be coming out soon. So hope you guys have a great holiday season. We do have a few programs. In fact, next Wednesday, we have a Zoom program in the evening with Smart Towns on Pearl Harbor and the Battle of Midway. We'd hope you'll join us then. Thanks for joining us.